Most people think closing a deal requires a dominant personality and loud demands. They believe that to win, you must crush the opposition, but they couldn't be more wrong. The world's most elite negotiators don't use blunt force. They use tactical empathy to make the other side feel completely in control, while they secretly dismantle every single layer of resistance. Today, we are revealing how to use calibrated questions and strategic silence to turn a firm no into a signed contract. Welcome to Clean Slate Audiobook. Today, we are entering the high-stakes room. When money, pride, or human lives are on the line, everything you have been taught about persuasion is likely going to get you killed, metaphorically or physically. Society loves the cinematic archetype of the aggressive alpha. We picture the table-pounding executive, the relentless closer who never takes no for an answer, the Wolf of Wall Street who dominates the room through sheer volume, intimidation, and an unyielding will. For decades, the business world has worshipped this model of negotiation. We have been conditioned to treat a negotiation table like a battlefield, where every concession is a wound, and the only acceptable outcome is total victory over a defeated opponent. But if you bring that energy into a true high-stakes negotiation today, you have already lost. To master the psychology of high-stakes leverage, we must first completely break the myth of the aggressive alpha. We must look at what actually happens inside the human brain when it is confronted with brute force. When you attempt to force an outcome, when you issue an ultimatum, or raise your voice to establish dominance, you immediately trigger the primitive biological alarm system in your counterpart's brain. Deep within the temporal lobe lies the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center. When you push aggressively, the other person's amygdala perceives your words not as a business proposition, but as an existential threat to their autonomy and status. In a fraction of a second, it floods their bloodstream with cortisol and adrenaline. The prefrontal cortex, the logical, rational, problem-solving part of the brain, is effectively shut down. Human nature dictates that when we are pushed, we must push back. Defenses go up, walls are built, and the negotiation devolves into a primitive, unproductive battle of egos. In this state of neurological lockdown, logic evaporates entirely. Deals die not because the financial numbers are wrong, but because the emotional friction in the room has become intolerable. The elite negotiator, whether they are talking down a bank robber, holding hostages, or closing a billion-dollar merger, takes a radically different path. They do not overpower, they outmaneuver. They understand that leverage is not about holding a gun to someone's head. True leverage is the ability to manipulate the emotional environment so seamlessly that the other person willingly hands you their weapon. To achieve this, the master negotiator utilizes a tool far more devastating than aggression: tactical empathy. Tactical empathy is a concept that is frequently misunderstood. It is not about being nice. It is not about feeling pity. It is certainly not about agreeing with the other side's demands. Tactical empathy is the calculated, deliberate act of hacking into your counterpart's emotional operating system. It is the ability to recognize their perspective, vocalize their hidden fears, and articulate their position better than they can themselves. Imagine you are sitting across from a vendor who is aggressively demanding a 20% price increase on a critical supply chain component. The amateur negotiator reacts with defensive logic. "We cannot afford that. Your competitors are cheaper. We have a contract." This response immediately invalidates the vendor's position and triggers the fight-or-flight response. The master negotiator, employing tactical empathy, takes a breath and leans into the friction. They do not argue facts. They address the underlying emotion. They might say, "It seems like you are under massive pressure from your own suppliers, and you feel like you are carrying the entire weight of this economic downturn on your shoulders." When you do this accurately, A profound psychological shift occurs in the room. The vendor's amygdala begins to deactivate. The cortisol levels drop. Why? Because the deepest, most desperate psychological craving of every human being is to feel safely seen and understood. The other person stops viewing you as an adversary and starts viewing you as a sounding board. You disarm them by simply vocalizing the emotional truth of their situation. You have not agreed to the 20% increase, but you have fundamentally altered the dynamic of the conversation. But to execute tactical empathy with surgical precision, you must possess an absolute mastery over your own biological response to pressure. You cannot calm another person's nervous system if your own system is in chaos. In a heated exchange, when the other side makes an outrageous demand, launches a personal attack, or threatens to walk away, your own heart rate will inevitably spike. The instinct to defend your ego is overwhelming. You will feel an intense, burning desire to prove them wrong, to demonstrate your own power, or to retaliate. This is the exact moment the amateur loses control of the negotiation, and the master takes over. The master understands a fundamental law of human interaction. The calmest person in the room inherently wields the most power. You must become the thermostat, not the thermometer. A thermometer simply reacts to the temperature of the room, rising and falling with the chaos around it. A thermostat dictates the temperature. This begins with the physical manipulation of your own voice. Elite hostage negotiators are trained to use what is known as the late-night FM DJ voice. It is a deep, soft, slow, and reassuring tone. Crucially, it employs a downward inflection at the end of every sentence. When your voice goes up at the end of a sentence, it sounds like a question. It sounds uncertain and seeking validation. When your voice goes down, it signals absolute authority, profound calm, and an immovable presence. When you speak to an agitated counterpart using the late-night FM DJ voice, you are not just communicating words, you are transmitting a neurochemical signal. You are physically forcing the other person's nervous system to decelerate and match your frequency. You neutralize the threat without ever raising your shield. You create a psychological safe harbor in the middle of a storm. Once the emotional temperature is lowered and the biological alarm bells are silenced, the real work of high-stakes leverage begins. Before a single offer is placed on the table, before you argue a single point of logic, you must identify the subterranean forces that are dictating the behavior of the person across from you. We operate under the dangerous illusion that negotiations are logical exercises. We believe that if we bring enough spreadsheets, data points, and rational arguments, the other side will inevitably surrender to the math. But human beings are not rational actors. We are profoundly emotional creatures who occasionally use logic to justify our emotional decisions. Every demand, every rejection, and every aggressive posturing in a negotiation is simply a facade. It is a mask hiding a much deeper, unarticulated psychological need. The person across from you is not just calculating profit margins or debating contractual clauses. They are desperately trying to protect their status. They are fighting for their autonomy. And above all, they are defending their deeply ingrained sense of fairness. If you ignore these hidden emotional drivers, you will hit an impenetrable brick wall. People will walk away from a highly profitable deal or sabotage a perfectly logical agreement if they feel they are being disrespected or if they feel they are losing control of their own narrative. Consider a classic high-stakes corporate acquisition. A massive conglomerate offers to buy a smaller, incredibly successful tech startup. The conglomerate offers a premium price, 20% above market value. The math is flawless. The logic dictates that the startup founder should take the money and celebrate. Yet, the founder violently rejects the offer, stalls the negotiations, and begins making irrational demands about office space and job titles. The conglomerate's negotiators are baffled. They argue the numbers, but the harder they push the logic, the more the founder resists. Why? Because the conglomerate is negotiating money, while the founder is negotiating identity. For 20 years, that startup was the founder's entire universe. To the conglomerate, it is a line item on a balance sheet. To the founder, it is their legacy, their child, and their proof of worth to the world. The hidden ego driver is the terrifying fear of irrelevance. The founder is subconsciously asking, "Who am I if I am no longer the CEO of this company? Will my employees be safe? Will my life's work be dismantled by a faceless corporation?" Until you uncover and address that specific existential fear, the 20% financial premium means absolutely nothing. This is where the elite negotiator deploys the psychological tool known as labeling. Labeling is the tactical application of empathy to neutralize negative emotions and reinforce positive ones. It is the art of validating an emotion by calling it by its name. Instead of arguing the financial merits of the buyout, the master negotiator leans back, utilizes the late-night FM DJ voice, and says, "It seems like you are deeply worried about what happens to your team after the ink dries. It sounds like you are fiercely protective of the legacy and the culture you spent 2 decades building." Analyze the architecture of those sentences. They do not start with, "I am hearing that," or "I think you are." The word "I" makes the conversation about you, and it immediately puts the other person on the defensive. The master negotiator uses phrases like, "It seems like," "It sounds like," or "It looks like." These phrases are psychologically brilliant. They are observations, not accusations. If you label an emotion incorrectly, the other person does not feel attacked. They will simply correct you, which still provides you with the exact information you are seeking. But when you label the emotion correctly, the impact is explosive. When that tech founder hears their deepest unspoken fears accurately labeled and validated by the adversary, the invisible barrier shatters. The tension leaves their shoulders. They finally feel safe enough to lower their shield. You have not given up a single dollar in the negotiation, but you have just purchased their trust. You have moved from sitting across the table as an opponent to sitting on the same side of the table, looking at the problem together. Furthermore, you must understand the powerful cognitive bias known as loss aversion. Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman proved that human beings are neurologically wired to feel the pain of a loss twice as intensely as the pleasure of an equivalent gain. We are far more motivated to avoid losing $500 than we are to find $500. Amateur negotiators spend all their time pitching the glorious benefits of their proposal. They paint a beautiful picture of what the other side will gain, but the master negotiator knows that dreams of future wealth do not move the needle as effectively as the fear of immediate loss. Once you have established tactical empathy and uncovered their hidden drivers, you must gently, carefully expose the void. You must help them realize what they stand to lose if this negotiation fails. You are not threatening them. You are allowing their own internal loss aversion to do the heavy lifting for you. You have now mapped the emotional landscape. You have silenced their biological alarms, labeled their hidden fears, and established an environment of profound psychological safety. You have absolute leverage, not because you are the loudest in the room, but because you are the only one who truly understands the terrain. But as the negotiation deepens, you will inevitably hit a roadblock. You will ask for a concession, and the other side will look you in the eye and say the one word that terrifies every amateur: no. Most people view the word no as the end of the negotiation. They see it as a failure, a rejection, a brick wall. But for the world-class negotiator, no is not the end of the conversation. No is exactly where the negotiation actually begins. But as the negotiation deepens, you will inevitably hit a roadblock. You will ask for a concession, propose a timeline, or attempt to secure a commitment, and the other side will look you in the eye and deliver the one word that terrifies every amateur: no. For decades, traditional sales training and corporate negotiation seminars have treated the word no as a catastrophic failure. We have been brainwashed into believing that the entire objective of a conversation is to corner the other person into saying yes. We construct elaborate yes momentum sequences, asking a series of obvious questions. Do you want to increase revenue? Do you want to reduce costs? Do you want a better future? Believing that if we can just get them to say yes enough times, they will be hypnotized into agreeing to the final proposal. This approach is profoundly flawed. It operates on the assumption that every yes is genuine. But the elite negotiator knows a dark truth about human behavior. There are three distinct types of yes. There is the commitment yes, which is a true agreement. There is the confirmation yes, which is a simple acknowledgement of a fact with no promise of action. And then there is the most dangerous of all, the counterfeit yes. A counterfeit yes is an escape hatch. When a human being feels cornered, pressured, or overwhelmed by a relentless pitch, their biological imperative is to escape the interaction. They will look you in the eye and say, "Yes, that sounds great. Send me the proposal," with absolutely no intention of ever signing it. They use the counterfeit yes to make you stop talking. They use it to safely exit the room without triggering a confrontation. If you chase the yes too early, you are almost certainly collecting counterfeit currency. You are building a massive deal on a foundation of polite lies. The master negotiator flips this paradigm entirely. They do not fear the word no. They actively seek it. They understand that no is not an act of rejection. It is a declaration of boundaries. Think about the physiological relief you feel when you finally tell a demanding salesperson, "No, I am not interested." Your shoulders drop. Your breathing normalizes. You feel a sudden surge of safety and autonomy. When a human being says no, they feel protected. They feel they have firmly established their sovereignty in the room. They have drawn a line in the sand, and by doing so, their amygdala deactivates. The perceived threat is neutralized. Because the word no provides such profound psychological safety, the world-class negotiator uses it as a tactical weapon to open the other person's mind. Instead of trying to force a yes, you deliberately construct your questions to invite a no. Consider the difference in these two approaches. The amateur calls a busy executive and asks, "Is this a good time to talk?" This question is a trap. It demands a yes, but the executive's time is their most precious resource. Their immediate instinct is defensive. How long will this take? What do they want? The master negotiator calls that same executive and asks, "Is now a ridiculous time to talk?" Listen to the psychological brilliance of that question. By inviting a no, you give the executive an immediate escape route. Because they feel safe, their natural response is almost always, "No, it's not ridiculous, but I only have a few minutes. What is this about?" You have bypassed their defense mechanism entirely by giving them the illusion of control. This principle applies to the most complex, high-stakes deadlocks. When a negotiation stalls and the other party is refusing to budge, do not ask them, "Do you agree with this direction?" That pressures them for a commitment they are not ready to make. Instead, ask for the no. Ask them, "Are you fundamentally opposed to this direction? Or does this proposal seem completely unreasonable to you?" When they say, "No, I am not fundamentally opposed, but I have issues with the timeline," they have just handed you the exact blueprint to solve the problem. They feel secure because they got to say no. But in doing so, They revealed the precise obstacle you need to dismantle. And what happens when the other side goes completely silent? What happens when they ignore your emails, dodge your calls, and ghost you during a critical negotiation? The amateur panics. They send desperate follow-up messages. Just checking in? Or, did you receive my last email? These messages reek of neediness and strip you of all your leverage. The master negotiator uses the ultimate no-oriented question to break the silence. They send a single one-line email. Have you given up on this project? This is a psychological masterstroke. It leverages the powerful cognitive bias of loss aversion and triggers the recipient's innate desire to defend their identity. No one wants to be perceived as a quitter. No one wants to admit they have abandoned a professional commitment. The mere suggestion that they have given up threatens their ego. Within minutes, the silent counterpart will inevitably reply, "No, we haven't given up at all. We have just been overwhelmed with an internal audit. Here is where we stand." With a single question designed to elicit a "no," you resurrect a dead deal without ever begging for their attention. You have now mastered the psychology of high-stakes leverage. You understand the biological danger of aggression. You know how to utilize the late-night FM DJ voice to dictate the emotional temperature of the room. You possess the tactical empathy to label hidden ego drivers, and you know how to wield the profound, comforting power of the word no. The emotional landscape is now secure. The biological alarms are completely silent. The person across from the table feels safe, understood, and entirely in control. But control is exactly what you want them to feel, because an illusion of control is the perfect cover for influence. Now, the true manipulation begins. How do we steer their mind? How do we take our desired outcome, plant it into their subconscious, and make them believe it was their own brilliant idea all along? The answer lies in the architecture of the calibrated question. You have successfully navigated the emotional minefield. You have used the late-night FM DJ voice to neutralize the biological alarms. You have deployed tactical empathy to make the person across from you feel profoundly understood. The defenses are down. The environment is secure. But empathy alone does not close a deal. Empathy merely builds the bridge. Now you must carefully direct the traffic across it. This brings us to the core engine of influence, the illusion of control. The greatest mistake amateurs make in a negotiation is believing that the person doing the talking is the person in charge. The amateur talks to assert dominance. They list their demands, they showcase their logic, and they try to verbally bludgeon the other side into submission. But the elite negotiator knows that speaking is a vulnerable act. When you are talking, you are revealing your strategy, your desires, and your limits. The master negotiator understands that the person asking the questions is the one truly controlling the room. But not just any questions. They use a highly specific psychological tool known as the calibrated question. A calibrated question is designed to remove the aggression from a demand and disguise it as a plea for help. It forces the other person to pause, engage their prefrontal cortex, and expend their own cognitive energy to solve your problem. When you ask a calibrated question, you give the other side the illusion of absolute control, while you secretly steer them exactly where you want them to go. The architecture of a calibrated question relies on eliminating verbs that trigger a yes or no response. Words like can, is, are, do, or does create closed loops. If you ask, "Can you lower the price?" you have given the other person the power to simply say, "No," shutting down the negotiation. Instead, the master negotiator relies almost exclusively on two words: what and how. What and how questions are open-ended. They do not invite a defensive no. They invite exploration. They make the other person feel like a valued consultant rather than an adversary. Furthermore, you must completely eradicate the word why from your vocabulary during a high-stakes conversation. In any language, and in any culture, the word why is inherently accusatory. When you ask someone, "Why did you do that?" or "Why are you asking for this timeline?" their brain immediately perceives it as an attack. They feel they are being interrogated, and they will instantly retreat into a defensive posture to justify their actions. Instead of asking why, you calibrate it into a what question. You change, "Why did you choose this vendor?" to, "What was it about this vendor that made them the best fit?" Do you feel the shift in the psychological weight? You have removed the accusation. You have transformed an interrogation into an invitation to share expertise. But of all the calibrated questions in the elite negotiator's arsenal, there is one that reigns supreme. It is the ultimate weapon of the FBI hostage negotiation team, and it is equally devastating in the corporate boardroom. It is the question, how am I supposed to do that? Imagine you are a contractor, and a major client suddenly demands that you deliver a 6-month project in just 3 months, without increasing the budget. The amateur contractor reacts with panic or anger. They say, "That is impossible. We cannot cut the timeline in half without sacrificing quality or adding more staff." This response creates immediate conflict. The client digs in their heels, and the power struggle begins. The master negotiator does not argue. They do not say no. They look the client in the eye, lower their voice, and ask with genuine deference, "How am I supposed to do that?" Let us analyze the profound neurological impact of this single sentence. First, it is an absolute boundary. It is a no, disguised as a question. But because it is phrased as a request for help, it does not trigger the client's amygdala. Second, it forces the client into your shoes. It demands tactical empathy from them. In order to answer the question, the client's brain must temporarily adopt your constraints. They have to look at the impossible timeline, look at the fixed budget, and realize the absurdity of their own demand. And third, it turns the adversary into a partner. You have handed them the puzzle and asked them to solve it. When confronted with, "How am I supposed to do that?" the client will often negotiate against themselves. They might pause and say, "Well, what if we reduce the scope of the project for the first phase?" Or, "If you can't do it in 3 months, what is the absolute best you can do?" Without making a single demand, without raising your voice, you have forced the other side to dismantle their own impossible ultimatum. You have given them the illusion of control, and they have used it to solve your problem. But securing an agreement in principle is not the final step. A master negotiator knows that getting someone to agree to a concept is useless if you do not secure the execution. How many times have you walked out of a meeting with a verbal agreement, only to find out a week later that nothing has been done? This is where the how question must be weaponized to guarantee implementation. A yes is nothing without a how. Once the counterpart agrees to a deal, you do not pack up your briefcase and leave. You immediately anchor the execution by asking a series of calibrated how questions. How will we know we are on track? How will we address this if we hit an unexpected roadblock next month? What happens if your legal team does not approve this clause? By asking these questions, you are doing 2 things. First, you are testing the structural integrity of their agreement. If they give vague, dismissive answers like, "Don't worry, we'll figure it out," you are dealing with a counterfeit. Yes, they are lying to you just to get you out of the room. Second, if they are genuine, you are forcing them to mentally construct the roadmap to your success. When they outline the steps, they are making a psychological commitment to the process. It becomes their plan, not yours. And human beings will fight relentlessly to protect a plan they believe they created. This process of securing the execution leads us to the critical concept of spotting deception. In high-stakes environments, you cannot rely solely on the words being spoken. You must learn to read the invisible data in the room. UCLA psychology professor Albert Mehrabian created the 7-3-8-5-5 rule, which dictates how we process communication, particularly when evaluating emotional intent. Only 7% of a message is conveyed through words. 38% is conveyed through tone of voice, and a staggering 55% is conveyed through body language. The amateur listens to the 7%. They hear the word yes, and they celebrate. The master negotiator evaluates the 93%. When you ask a calibrated question, you must observe the physiological reaction. Does their tone of voice match the certainty of their words? Are they looking away when they make a promise? Do they suddenly start using overly complex, convoluted sentences? In psychology, this is known as the Pinocchio effect. When people lie, they tend to use more words than necessary, attempting to build a wall of text to hide the deception. If the words say yes, but the tone is flat and the body language is closed, you must lean into the mismatch. You use a calibrated label. It sounds like you are saying yes, but it seems like there is something still holding you back. You do not accuse them of lying. You simply illuminate the inconsistency and invite them to explain it. The architecture of calibrated questions is the ultimate form of conversational judo. You are not using your own strength to move the opponent. You are using their momentum against them. You guide their focus, you dismantle their demands, and you architect their promises, all while making them feel like the smartest person in the room. But what happens when you ask the perfect calibrated question and the other person simply stares at you? What happens when the room falls completely silent and the pressure becomes almost unbearable? The amateur will panic and start talking to fill the void. The master, however, knows that silence is not empty. Silence is the heaviest weapon on the table. You have successfully rewired the conversation. You have eliminated the accusatory why and deployed the open-ended how and what. You have looked your counterpart in the eye and delivered the ultimate calibrated question. How am I supposed to do that? The trap is perfectly set. The psychological burden has been entirely shifted onto their shoulders. But this is the exact moment where 99% of amateur negotiators snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. They ask the brilliant question, and then, terrified by the sudden absence of noise, they keep talking. They answer their own question. They offer a preemptive concession. They apologize. They rescue the counterpart from the pressure. To achieve absolute mastery and high-stakes leverage, you must cultivate the most difficult, unnatural, and devastating discipline in human communication. You must learn to shut your mouth. You must master strategic silence. In everyday social conditioning, silence is deeply uncomfortable. From childhood, we are neurologically programmed to view a pause in conversation as a failure, a sign of awkwardness, or an indicator of social rejection. Our brains are hardwired to seek harmony, and noise is the auditory proof of that harmony. When the room goes quiet, our internal alarm systems begin to hum. Anxiety rises. The primal urge to fill the void, to fix the awkwardness by speaking, becomes almost overwhelmingly physical. The elite negotiator does not fear this void. They weaponize it. They understand that in a high-stakes environment, silence is not empty. It is a physical weight. And whoever breaks the silence first absorbs that weight. When you ask a calibrated question and immediately go dead silent, you are creating a psychological vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum, and human nature will inevitably rush to fill it. By holding your tongue, you force the other person's brain into a state of cognitive overdrive. They are sitting with your question. How am I supposed to do that? and the silence is amplifying the pressure of that question with every passing second. The discomfort builds on their side of the table, not yours. Because you are anchored in your late-night FM DJ voice and absolute internal calm, the silence does not threaten you. You are the observer. They are the subject. Consider a high-stakes salary negotiation. You are a highly specialized consultant sitting across from a corporate hiring manager. They offer you a compensation package that is 20% below your established market value. The amateur gets defensive. They list their degrees, they cite industry averages, and they aggressively demand more money. The hiring manager counters with company policy, and a deadlock ensues. The master negotiator takes a different approach. They look at the offer sheet, slide it gently back across the table, look the hiring manager in the eye, and say, "This is a very generous offer for a standard role, but given the specific revenue targets you have asked me to hit within the first 6 months, how am I supposed to accept this?" And then, you stop. You do not blink. You do not check your phone. You simply hold a soft, immovable gaze, and you count to 10 in your head. 1, 2, 3. The first 3 seconds are standard conversational pacing. 4, 5, 6. At second 6, the social contract is broken. The hiring manager's anxiety spikes. They feel the unbearable weight of the unanswered question. The silence is deafening. 7, 8, 9. At this point, the pressure becomes intolerable. The hiring manager's biological urge to relieve the tension overrides their strategic discipline. They will break the silence, and when they speak, they will almost always negotiate against themselves. They might stammer, "Well, I mean, the base salary is fixed by HR, but we could potentially look at a signing bonus, or perhaps accelerate your equity vesting schedule." Without making a single demand, without raising your voice, without offering a single logical argument, you just increased your total compensation package by tens of thousands of dollars. You did it entirely by weaponizing the void. But strategic silence is not only used after a calibrated question. It is the core component of another devastating FBI interrogation technique known as mirroring. Mirroring is the art of imitating the core behavior of your counterpart to establish profound subconscious rapport. In negotiation, it is executed in its simplest, most effective form. You simply repeat the last 1 to 3 critical words of your counterpart's sentence, inflecting your voice upward slightly to make it sound like a genuine question. And then, you deploy strategic silence. Imagine you are negotiating a software contract, and the vendor suddenly says, "We have to require a 2-year lock-in for this tier of service because of our back-end integration costs." You do not argue. You do not ask them to explain. You simply mirror the core issue, back-end integration costs, and then you drop into total silence. You have just triggered a biological reflex. By mirroring their words, you have signaled that you are paying deep attention, but you are confused and need them to elaborate. The upward inflection invites them to speak, and the silence forces them to comply. The vendor will immediately begin over-explaining. "Yes, well, when we onboard a client of your size, our engineering team has to build custom API bridges, and that takes about 3 weeks of dedicated manpower." You have just extracted highly classified operational data. You now know their pain point: engineering time. You can now pivot the negotiation not around the price, but around minimizing their engineering effort. You extracted this intelligence simply by echoing 3 words and shutting your mouth. Mirroring, combined with silence, is the closest thing to a Jedi mind trick in human psychology. It makes the other person feel incredibly listened to, while simultaneously forcing them to empty their pockets of every piece of strategic information they possess. They will talk and talk and talk desperately trying to fill the silence and clarify their position, while you sit back and quietly map out their entire defense system. The discipline required to execute this is immense. When you mirror someone and wait, your own brain will scream at you to speak. Your ego will beg you to jump in and show how smart you are. You must physically train yourself to resist this urge. Bite the inside of your cheek. Dig your fingernails into your palm. Breathe deeply from your diaphragm. Do whatever it takes to anchor your body and endure the pause. Remember this fundamental law of the high-stakes room. The person who is talking is giving up information. The person who is listening is gaining power. We have now established the complete defensive perimeter. You know how to calm the nervous system. You know how to extract the hidden ego drivers. You know how to frame calibrated questions. And you know how to use silence to force the other side to surrender their leverage. But all of these techniques have been reactionary. You have been beautifully managing the demands of the other side. Now, we must go on the offensive. How do you aggressively set the terms of reality before the negotiation even begins? How do you manipulate their perception of value so severely that a terrible offer looks like a gift? We are about to enter the darkest, most manipulative phase of negotiation psychology. It is time to master the art of extreme anchoring. You have mastered the architecture of calibrated questions. You have weaponized the uncomfortable weight of strategic silence. You know how to extract the hidden emotional drivers of your counterpart. You are equipped to handle any negotiation that begins on neutral ground. But what happens when the ground is no longer neutral? What happens when the negotiation is already broken? In the real world of high-stakes business and deeply entrenched personal conflicts, you rarely start with a blank canvas. You inherit history. You step into a room carrying the heavy baggage of missed deadlines, broken promises, passive-aggressive emails, and festering resentments. When bad blood has poisoned the well, no amount of late-night FM DJ voice or calibrated questioning will save the deal. The other side is not listening to your logic. They are only listening to their own anger. They have already decided you are the enemy. Before you can secure an agreement about the future, you must learn how to systematically dismantle the past. You must execute the most difficult psychological maneuver in the negotiator's playbook. You must employ the clean slate technique. Welcome to the namesake philosophy of our channel. To create a clean slate, you cannot ignore the mess. You cannot politely step over the elephant in the room and pretend everything is fine. The amateur attempts to gloss over past mistakes with forced optimism, saying things like, "Let's put the past behind us and focus on moving forward." This approach is a fatal error. It completely invalidates the other person's anger. It tells them that their grievance is irrelevant, which immediately triggers their amygdala and forces them to defend their right to be furious. The master negotiator takes the exact opposite approach. To erase the negative emotional baggage, you must lean into the conflict. You must articulate the other person's worst fears and deepest resentments better than they can articulate them themselves. This is known as conducting an accusation audit. An accusation audit is the aggressive, proactive cataloging of every single negative assumption, every valid complaint, and every terrible thing the other side could possibly think about you. You do not wait for them to attack. You steal their thunder by attacking yourself first. Imagine you are a contractor, and you are walking into a meeting with a furious client because your team missed a critical delivery deadline by 3 weeks. The project is a disaster. The client is ready to fire you and sue for breach of contract. The amateur walks in, immediately gets defensive, and starts making excuses about supply chain issues and unexpected employee turnover. The client's rage boils over. The master negotiator walks into that same room, utilizes the calmest, deepest voice they possess, and opens the meeting with an accusation audit. Before we begin, I want to say something. You have every right to be furious with me right now. You are probably thinking that I am incredibly unprofessional, that my company is completely disorganized, and that hiring us was the biggest mistake you have made this year. It looks like I have completely disregarded your timeline, shown zero respect for your budget, and forced you into a terrible position with your own stakeholders. If I were sitting in your chair, I would want to fire me immediately. Then, you deploy the strategic silence. You let that massive, brutal confession hang in the air. What happens to the human brain when it is confronted with an accusation audit? The client walked into that room loaded with emotional ammunition, ready to list every single failure and scream at you. But you just stole their entire script. By proactively vocalizing their anger, you have instantly validated their emotional reality. Because you did not make excuses, they have nothing left to attack. The psychological shift is instantaneous and profound. When you accuse yourself so harshly, the other person's natural instinct, their biological drive to maintain social equilibrium, forces them to disagree with you. Instead of screaming, the client will almost inevitably lean back, sigh, and say, "Well, look, I wouldn't say you are the worst contractor we've ever hired. We understand that supply chain issues happen. We are just incredibly frustrated because we have our own deadlines. You have not fixed the delayed project. The problem still exists, but you have completely neutralized the emotional toxicity. You have drained the venom from the room. By anticipating and vocalizing their worst-case assumptions, you have made those assumptions sound unreasonable. You have successfully hit the reset button on the relationship. You have created a clean slate. The clean slate technique is not an apology. An apology is often perceived as a sign of weakness. It focuses on your guilt. An accusation audit focuses entirely on their perspective. It is an act of extreme empathy and supreme confidence. It demonstrates that you are secure enough in your own competence to stare directly into your own failures without flinching. This technique is equally devastating in high-stakes personal relationships. When you know you are about to deliver bad news to a spouse or a family member, you prime their nervous system for the blow. You start by saying, "I am about to tell you something that is going to sound incredibly selfish. You are going to think I haven't considered your feelings at all, and that I am prioritizing my own career over our family." By setting the baseline expectations so low, by painting the worst possible picture of yourself, the actual news, "I have to take a business trip this weekend," feels significantly less damaging. Their brain was braced for a catastrophe, and you only delivered an inconvenience. The clean slate technique requires immense courage. Our egos desperately want to defend our actions and justify our mistakes. We are terrified of acknowledging our flaws. But the elite negotiator knows that vulnerability, when deployed strategically, is the ultimate form of armor. When you own the worst version of the narrative, no one can use it against you. You have now mastered the art of the reset. You have silenced the biological alarms. You have uncovered the hidden ego drivers. You have used calibrated questions to steer the conversation, and you have neutralized the toxic history with an accusation audit. The table is finally clear. The counterpart is calm, engaged, and ready to collaborate. Now, we move to the final, critical phase of the high-stakes negotiation. You have established trust. Now you must establish value. How do you bend their perception of reality so severely that a mediocre offer looks like a masterpiece? How do you ensure that when you finally place a number on the table, they cannot wait to say yes? We are about to deploy the psychological weapon of anchoring expectations. You have cleared the emotional battlefield. The biological alarms are quiet. You have utilized tactical empathy, calibrated questions, and the devastating power of strategic silence to map the terrain. You have executed the clean slate technique, using an accusation audit to erase the toxic history and reset the relationship. The person across the table feels safe, understood, and entirely in control. But a negotiation without a close is just a pleasant conversation. Now, you must extract tangible value. You must place a demand on the table. But how do you introduce a number or a term without triggering the very defenses you just worked so hard to dismantle? You do it by manipulating their neurological perception of reality. You do it through the psychological weapon of anchoring. Human beings do not process value objectively. We process value relatively. In the 1970s, cognitive psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman proved that the human brain relies heavily on the first piece of information it receives, the anchor, to make subsequent judgments. If you walk into a luxury boutique and see a watch for $10,000, your brain establishes that as the baseline. When the salesperson then shows you a watch for $2,000, your brain instantly perceives it as a massive bargain, even if you never intended to spend $2,000 on a watch in your life. The anchor bent your reality. Amateur negotiators are terrified of going first. They believe that by letting the other side make the first offer, they gain an informational advantage. They say, "I want to see where they stand." But the master negotiator knows that whoever drops the first anchor dictates the entire spectrum of the negotiation. If you let them anchor first, you will spend the rest of the meeting fighting your way out of their reality. To anchor successfully in a high-stakes environment, you do not just throw out a wildly aggressive number. That triggers the amygdala and destroys trust. Instead, you bend their reality by anchoring their emotions first, before you ever anchor the math. Before you state your price or your demand, you utilize another accusation audit to brace them for the blow. You lean in, utilize the late-night FM DJ voice, and say, "I am about to propose something that you are going to hate. You are going to think my numbers are completely out of line, and you might even feel insulted. You will probably want to walk away from this table." By painting this catastrophic emotional picture, you trigger their loss aversion and their defensive bracing mechanisms. Their brain prepares for an absolutely absurd, offensive demand. When you finally deliver your actual number, which is high, but not insane, the relief they feel completely overrides their desire to fight. The anchor was set so low emotionally that your financial anchor suddenly feels reasonable. When you do drop the mathematical anchor, you must utilize the psychological principle of extreme precision. Amateurs negotiate in round numbers. They ask for $50,000, or a 20% discount, or a 6-month extension. Round numbers feel arbitrary. They feel like a starting point for a haggling process. They invite the other side to simply counter with another round number. The master negotiator never uses round numbers. If your target is $50,000, you do not ask for 50. You ask for $52,475. Think about the psychological impact of that specific number, $52,475. It does not look like a guess. It looks like the result of a rigorous, unyielding mathematical calculation. It implies that you have done extensive research, factored in inflation, calculated overhead costs to the penny, and arrived at an absolute baseline. The counterpart's brain subconsciously assumes that this number cannot be easily moved, because it is so incredibly specific. Precision creates an illusion of immovable authority. But what happens when the negotiation is not just about money? What happens when you hit a deadlock on the core issue, and neither side can budge? The amateur digs their heels in and argues harder, turning the negotiation into a zero-sum game of tug-of-war. The elite negotiator executes a pivot to non-monetary terms. If the hiring manager cannot give you the salary you want because of a rigid corporate band, you do not fight the band. You pivot. You ask a calibrated question. If we cannot move the base salary, how can we structure the compensation to reflect the value I am bringing? What flexibility do we have with an extra week of paid time off, a remote work schedule, Or an accelerated performance review in 3 months? You expand the pie. You identify elements of the deal that are cheap for them to give, but highly valuable for you to receive. You construct a victory that does not rely solely on the initial anchor. Finally, you must be prepared to defend against the most manipulative, dangerous word in the entire English language during a negotiation. It is the ultimate trigger word. The word is fair. When a counterpart looks at you and says, "We just want what's fair," or "I have given you a fair offer," they are not making a logical statement. They are dropping a psychological nuclear bomb. The concept of fairness is deeply wired into the primate brain. When we feel we are being treated unfairly, our amygdala fires with the same intensity as if we were experiencing physical pain. When someone says, "I've given you a fair offer," they are subconsciously accusing you of being unfair, greedy, and unreasonable if you do not accept it. The amateur instantly gets defensive and capitulates to prove they are a good person. The master negotiator never falls for the F word. When the other side uses the word fair, you do not get angry. You pause. You deploy the late-night FM DJ voice, and you mirror them. Fair? You let the silence hang. Then, you say, "It seems like you are ready to provide the evidence that supports how you arrived at that number." You neutralize their emotional manipulation by politely forcing them to justify their anchor with objective data. Alternatively, the master negotiator proactively uses the word fair to establish absolute psychological dominance at the very beginning of the meeting. You open the negotiation by looking the counterpart in the eye and saying, "My primary goal today is to treat you fairly at all times. So please, stop me at any time if you feel I am being unfair, and we will address it immediately." This is a masterstroke of influence. You have instantly positioned yourself as an honest, honorable actor. You have given them the illusion of control by inviting them to stop you. But more importantly, you have subtly set the rule that any future disagreement must be based on objective fairness, not emotional demands. We have deconstructed the architecture of high-stakes leverage. You now understand that negotiation is not a battle of logic, but a delicate, tactical navigation of human emotion. You know that aggression is a biological vulnerability. You know that whoever asks the calibrated how and what questions controls the reality of the room. You know how to wield the unbearable weight of strategic silence. You know how to erase a toxic past with the clean slate accusation audit. And you know how to anchor expectations using emotional bracing and extreme precision. The days of relying on brute force and dominant posturing are over. You no longer need to raise your voice to command respect. You no longer need to force a yes when a no provides the exact blueprint to victory. The tools are now in your hands. The room is waiting. The person across the table believes they are ready for a fight. They have no idea that they are about to negotiate against themselves. This has been Clean Slate Audiobook. The noise has faded. The table is set. Now, go close the deal.